very good morning to you all, friends, colleagues. I know we've got people from Europe and around the world today, and I this morning want to share a little bit of both my personal thoughts, but also the BPF perspectives on Brexit and some of the things that we are doing and that we need to continue to do to make sure that this vibrant sector of the UK economy continues to have a very, very bright future. So, just to add a little bit onto what Philip has already said about my background, to let you know why I'm qualified perhaps to talk to you today. Over 33 years in the plastics sector. I've started off in manufacturing, injection moulding, thermoforming. I've spent almost 30 years in the distribution sector, 3 decades in which I've seen the fortunes of British plastics manufacturing really grow and prosper. The last decade has been fantastic following a long period of consolidation. I'm a qualified plastics technologist, which I guess means I'm well able to look at the needs of the industry and talk on a professional level with a wide range of people. As Philip said, I'm a past president of the BPF. I chair the Polymer Distributors and Compounders Group as well, and that's a very significant channel to market within the BPF. I do have a corporate slide because at the end of the day, Plastibution's my employer. They pay the wages. We're one of the UK's leading distributors. We've won a number of awards. We've got about 45 staff in the UK focusing on the needs of servicing UK plastic processors. Our objective is to be their preferred choice. We carry inventory in the UK over 3,500 tonnes. We work with about 35 global suppliers bringing product to the UK. And you'll see why that's important later on. We've got some interesting information and stats about the UK plastics industry. And we're a pretty experienced team. I've got some colleagues here, apparently we share 180 years of combined technical and management experience. It sounds like a lot. So, as Philip said, in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, which I remember very well on the 22nd of June last year, I was at a conference in Amsterdam, presenting a paper, and we actually had a straw poll of the Brits. So we're British manufacturing from the plastics industry represented, and probably like everybody else at that time, the expectation and the straw poll said strongly remain. And yet 2 days later, we faced probably one of the biggest shocks we've had in certainly my political memory of going from a remain to a Brexit. And in the wake of that, the BPF immediately reacted and said, we need to do something about this because there's going to be some big implications for our industry. So we immediately set up a Brexit committee and started working on trying to understand what Brexit could mean for the industry and what we could do about it. But clearly, very much a moving feast. Every day something happens in the negotiations, and we then have to consider the impact of that and how we're going to react to it. So the BPF was right there at the forefront. And just to remind you how that vote went, yes, it was a Brexit vote, but only by a narrow margin. I think the number of people who voted for Brexit was something like 16 million out of a population of 65. Take from that what you will. All I will say is, democracy is not always a good thing, perhaps, but other people may have other views. Just to show you that that's the spread of companies throughout the UK in terms of plastics. So we're pretty well spread throughout the UK in terms of representation. I don't think any Brexit discussion can go ahead without looking at exchange rates. And so a 2-year time horizon, and things have not been quite so bad against the dollar because of changes in the White House, but 155 down to about 130. But look at that trend line on the euro. We just got above 140. And today we think we're doing really well because it's gone back up to 113. Compared to 140, we're still a long way from where we were. Obviously, that's implications in terms of a business, and again, we'll come back into what the import-export balance is, but we follow the rest of the economy. The UK plastics sector is a net importer, so this is a driver of input costs, and quite a strong driver. So we're seeing inflation in terms of raw materials. If people are investing in plant and machinery, that's putting up costs. And if we're employing overseas workers, actually the wages they're repatriating are going down in value. Just a little bit about the British Plastics Federation. I think Philip's done a great job of introducing it. Maybe some of the key factors are we've been around for 80 years. It's the #1 world's plastics association. About 80% of the UK turnover is represented by the BPF. So again, in terms of the Brexit discussions and negotiations and what the BPF does, I think it has a pretty strong mandate. Over 500 members, a fantastic staff of people, and a lot of activity on social media, including a lot of web page views. I thought I'd come back to this slide. I already talked about my 3 decades in the UK plastics industry, and I think sometimes we do ourselves down in terms of what we're capable of doing and what we actually do. And if you look there, in terms of value added, you know, we're above France, we're just behind Germany, and we're not that far away from the US. And when I look at my time in the industry, I've seen a lot of the more basic type stuff disappearing. The more commoditized applications like raffia and BOPP have largely left the UK, and what we have left is a pretty sophisticated, pretty well equipped, pretty efficient, forward-looking industry. So I think that's a very important takeaway in terms of how important our industry is and how well it's evolved over the last 3 decades. I think this is a really good slide. Philip already touched on the £23.5 billion worth of turnover in our sector, 6,200 companies. Up in the top there, 3.3 million tonnes of plastics processed, 1.7 million tonnes produced. And that comes back to this net trade deficit. We have to import an awful lot of plastic raw materials to sustain our industry. So going back to firstly that issue of devaluation, that's increased input costs, and also looking at some of the potential outcomes of Brexit, it also means that duty could be a big factor, and I'll come back to that later. I think another very important point is 27 employees on average per company means that we are a business of SMEs, and representation by a federation then becomes very, very important. And we have great membership and a lot of membership inquiries, and we encourage people to come into the federation to do that. And finally, we have a pretty healthy export situation, 7.5 billion of exports. Just to touch on the production of plastics in the UK, these are all the sites. They go from world-scale plants in polyolefins, so people like INEOS and SABIC, and then we have some more specialty products like fluorocarbons, PEEK. We have some PVC production, both emulsion and suspension, and PET, but we don't certainly have everything. There's a lot of gaps in that portfolio, which means to sustain a vibrant industry, we have to import plastic raw materials to manufacture the goods needed by our key industry sectors like packaging, construction, automotive, medical, industrial. All of those need raw materials which aren't produced in the UK. And this basically puts our situation in perspective with other countries. So like Italy, we're big net importers. You look at countries like Spain, France and Germany, essentially on paper they're net exporters of raw materials. So we're in quite a tough spot in terms of needing those imports. And I think these figures have been slightly updated, but in terms of manufacturing, plastics is a key sector. Over 160,000 employees puts us number 2 or number 3 in the manufacturing sector in terms of numbers employed. And manufacturing, as we all know, is a key part of any economy and is actually a growing part of the UK economy. So we need to be aware of that. Also, and I'd encourage you to spend time here, is the BPF with its very active web presence. We've created a specific web page relating to the EU and Brexit. And if you want to get information and resources to share with friends, colleagues, shareholders, other people in the industry, this is a great place to go. It's regularly updated, so you'll see the information is updated on a regular basis. Also, there's some really good downloads there, which you can take away and use. Also, we've tried to make sure that we keep people informed. We ran a very successful Brexit conference on the 5th of July, very well attended, and also a great range of speakers, again, trying to give people information about the potential implications of Brexit. So they range from accountancy, legal, through to recruitment, through to market pricing and market information, also through to exporting as well. And obviously one of the impacts of devaluation is, in theory, we become much more competitive from an export viewpoint. We will run further conferences as well, because as things change, we'll do further updates. So we're planning to probably do something in Q1 2018. Going back to the BPF, one of the roles of the Brexit committee is to try and help the BPF to understand what the industry needs and where to apply its resources. And one of the big challenges is, at the moment, Brexit as a concept is spread across all of these government departments. So the BPF has a massive task to try and engage with all of these departments and get across the key messages. But you can see there's 5 department layers to engage with. And I've got to say, I've been very impressed with the level of contact and engagement and response. You know, the BPF gets listened to, which is very, very important for us as a sector. Also, we clearly have to engage and coordinate with other trade associations. We don't just want to repeat what other trade associations are doing. We want to reinforce that, but also get across the important messages for ourselves as well. So it's very important we're coordinated. We know government has limited resources, so we want to use it in the most effective way possible. And the other point I make is, we've got organisations like Plastics Europe there as well. Actually, as you travel around Europe, you talk to trade associations, they have a lot of concern as well about what Brexit means for them and their industry and their members. So this is a two-way street. I think often from the UK we think of Brexit in our terms. There's also the fact that there's another 27 European members out there, and just by virtue of the UK leaving the EU becomes a smaller trading bloc than it was, but it's no longer number one. So it is a big deal all the way through. Another key factor is we rely on resource, and I'll come on to the numbers in a minute, but in terms of the sector, we are very dependent upon non-UK EU workers to sustain our industry. And of those, about 56% are low-skilled, about 25% are mid-skilled, and about 19% are high-skilled. And this is really important. To sustain an industry, we need a complete spectrum. There may be an argument to say, for low-skilled, we should continue to automate. But I believe in the UK economy, a lot of that has already happened. The low-hanging fruit of robotics and other investment has already happened. The next level of investment comes at a very high price when you want to get very high levels of automation. And we've got to be careful with government that they don't use this as a lever to say, push the automation, drive productivity, which is a big issue. But obviously in terms of mid-skilled and high-skilled, these are really just essential to the smooth running of our companies. And talk to anybody in the UK plastics sector, there's a challenge to get technical managers and technical expertise involved. And generally there's an aging demographic in that area as well, so getting people into that sector is very important. And in the high skilled as well, management with experience. Also, if we look at areas like technical sales as well, there's a real shortage of skill in those areas, and those are all areas that are needed to enable a company to survive and prosper. And when we come to temporary workers as well, there's seasonality in all businesses, and certainly the UK plastics sector is no exception. You see seasonality because of holidays, because of the summer vacations, because of Christmas, but also bear in mind food packaging is a massive area of application for plastics. Around about 40% goes into packaging today, and that's a seasonalised business in the UK. We have 4 seasons, and generally food is produced in the summer and autumn periods. So to sustain that, often we have to have temporary labour, and here we become even more dependent upon EU migrant workers coming to work for us. And this is also reflected in other sectors like food processing as well. So if we look at skill and origin level, again, this is really important and how essential Europe has been to us. So look at the low skill, 19% of the workforce is coming from Europe. Look at the mid-skill, 8%, and look at the high skill, and we've got 7% coming from Europe. And to compare with that with the rest of the world, it's sub 2%. So it's a very important resource to us to make sure we have access to skills, and I'll come back to the summary on that later. I think this is a very important slide, and there's more detail to follow in the next slide, but look at our trade with Europe. We're exporting 5.6 billion, we're importing 9.1 billion. Are we important to Europe? By heck we are. You know, that's a lot of business in anybody's books. It's a 3.6 billion deficit. Rest of the world, put it in perspective, 2.9 billion of exports, 3.9 billion of imports, so 1.1 billion deficit. So we are importing a lot, but most of it's coming from Europe. And as we look at it on a global level, this really puts it in perspective. 70% of our trade is with Europe. The next highest level is Asia with 16%, North America 8%, and then generally things are falling down to some pretty low levels beyond there. So Europe is the most important partner that we have today, and probably will have to be a very important partner for the future. This is probably one of the most important slides. The data here is incredible. So we have talk of a hard Brexit which takes us into WTO rules. And some calculations have been done on the financial impact on the plastics industry. So on those imports, £540 million increase in cost to the UK plastics processing sector. On the export side, if you're buying the product and you're currently in Europe, so you're any of the European countries, those goods will cost you an additional 340 million. As we know, generally speaking, prices don't go up. So there's a chance that a lot of that's going to be pushed back into the UK economy, pushed back onto UK manufacturers. That is almost £1 billion penalty if we have a hard Brexit. I would argue that's going to have a massive impact on our industry in terms of its ability to compete on a world scale. And like it or not, we're in a global environment and it's becoming more globalized. So that's got to be, you know, a really big takeaway. It's a number that's going to be pushed very hard in front of government. We think the numbers are very well calculated and justifiable. So we're going to be pushing that very, very hard, because a hard Brexit looks like very bad news for UK plastics manufacturing. So just now starting to look at how we do business around the world, if you like, and putting things in a global perspective. We are going to become more globally outlooking, I think. That's an inevitable consequence of Brexit. And you know, where do we do business at the moment? Well, in terms of total trade, Germany is our number one partner. We then go Belgium, Netherlands, France. So the top four are occupied by European countries in terms of our total trade. We then move into China and the USA. Our first trade surplus comes with Ireland on a net basis. So generally we're in a trade deficit, and this is the global picture. We start breaking that down into segments. We can look, first of all, at plastic scrap. Our biggest partner is China. I think this is pretty well known. In order to meet recycling targets, to get rid of waste, it's generally going to China, where it's then being sorted, reprocessed and put into new applications. The rest are relatively small, but again, the key players there are really with Netherlands and Germany, so again, European partners. If we look at equipment, and equipment is very vital to plastics processing, we can't do it without. The UK is a relatively small player these days in terms of manufacturing equipment. We have some great niche players, but in terms of you're buying injection molding machinery, extrusion plant, blow molding plant, the chances are it's not coming from the UK, it's coming from elsewhere. The majority of that is clearly coming from Germany, also Austria, a lot of green machines coming from Austria, so, and the USA and Italy as well. So again, in there we've got three European countries in the top four in terms of equipment. And then if we look at plastic materials, here's an incredible story. You know, it's a big requirement. We're have to import over 50% of our requirements. Probably the reality is somewhere between 70 and 80% of what is processed in the UK, if we take account of trade, is imported from the rest of the world. Germany being the big player, Belgium number 2, Netherlands number 3, France number 4. We'll probably see a bit of growth in the US following the shale gas expansions that are coming now, but even so, all the big partners are from Europe, so very, very important that we have good access to those markets and they can trade with us easily. We're importing a lot from Germany, number one, which may be a bit of a surprise. China, number two, probably not such a big surprise. And then some other countries like France, America, Ireland, we've got a trade surplus, which is the first trade surplus. And again, a trade surplus with Spain, but generally net imports. Thought I'd say a few words about port friction. Obviously, we're very dependent upon imports, and we're in a supply chain business ourselves. Actually, getting things through port is very important. At the moment, things flow through the port of Dover with almost no interference. We're in a common market, we're in a customs union. As soon as we start bringing things in from elsewhere, we then have to go through a customs barrier. Felixstowe is probably one of the main container ports. We use it a lot. It's very, very smooth. About 97% of product comes through without being touched by customs. But it comes through at a cost of £45 per container. So again, we could imagine costs if we have a hard customs barrier at Dover, both delays potentially in terms of clearing customs, but also additional costs, which will also ultimately be passed on to plastic processors, again, effective competitiveness. BPF does a great job, so we've got a strategy document in which a lot of information is contained, also about our relationship with Europe and making sure that that is there front and centre. In terms of our key priorities, we would say free access to the single market. That might be very difficult, but we need easy access to the single market as a sector. We need access to those skills. We need to maintain and develop legislation compatible with the EU. If you're an exporter, you don't only need to be compatible with your own legislation or comply with it, you've also got to comply with the export countries. And I'll show you some of the legislations that we need to think about in a moment. And finally, we want to have a business that's supported, or an industry by British government with help overseas. So these are some of the many, many important regulations that we need to meet and consider. Probably the really hot topic at the moment is REACH. So consider this, we've had the repeal bill or the latest version of it. The idea is to bring European law into UK law, and yet ECHA, the body responsible for REACH, lives outside the UK. So how do we maintain our REACH compliance? How do we interact with ECHA, or do we have another organisation? If so, how do we set it up? It's a nightmare. 30,000 substances apply within REACH. What do we do? Nobody has a solution today. So that's a real concern, and probably a very good reason why we need at least a 2-year transition period. Investment innovation is very important, creates fantastic returns on what is spent. Here are some important numbers, but we need that money, we need that continued support to go to overseas trade fairs and promote the good things that the plastics industry does in the UK. I'm always a bit worried about presenting this slide in front of Europeans, but Winston Churchill, many people will know, was actually somebody who encouraged the foundation of Europe in the concept of we know it today, and has led to a tremendous period of peace. We've been part of the EU, or the common market it was, for over 40 years. But yeah, he really encouraged people to talk rather than to war. And you know, if you look at the negotiations at the moment, I would argue we're more at the war rather than the jaw. Hopefully we can get things moving. There are some encouraging signs, but you know, we have to bear in mind that we've got to talk about these things. And I would say, do not leave that just to the politicians. The politicians have probably got us where we are today, and not everybody is very happy with where we are today. So, you know, we are constituents, we're people in industry, we have shareholders both within the UK and overseas, we have trade contacts. You know, certainly when I travel, people want to talk to me about Brexit, not because I'm chair of the Brexit committee necessarily, just they're interested. And I think we need to encourage that engagement at all levels. Please, if you've got a local MP, encourage them to come and visit you and talk about the Brexit implications. I'm going to end on a slightly lighter note. The people maybe of my sort of age and slightly younger will remember Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which was a 1980s satirical comedy which looked at how the civil service interacted with government and who was actually in control, which was often questionable. I'd say thank you very much for your time. BPF does a great job. We've got some fantastic people involved with the Brexit committee, so it's really representative. Predominantly it's from the manufacturing sector. We've got some great people who have a real interest in trying to make sure that our sector gets a great outcome. We'll continue to engage with government. We're trying all the angles we can. Whether ultimately that comes down to having a sector deal, I don't know, but every possibility is being explored. Like I say, I'm very grateful for the fact that we appear to be getting a 2-year extension, because that might enable some sense to occur. But please continue to watch what happens and do your best to try and help us achieve a great outcome. Thank you, you've been a great audience.